The first module today comprises of three components. How do you define your customer? How do you build your value proposition? And how do you understand competition? And this is very critical because in any category today, there is immense competition and you will face the heat, especially because you are a startup. Your customer needs to be your focus. In fact, I strongly believe, based on my experience, that's not enough anymore. Your customer needs to be your obsession, and you need to know as much about this customer as you can possibly do through research and through face-to-face interviews. In fact, as Jeff Bezos says, make your customer your obsession and build your business not around your product or your competition, but around the customer. And that is exactly what he has done with Amazon. Customer obsession begins with customer knowledge. And in today's world, the definition of a customer includes a whole bunch of stakeholders. So what I have on this slide talks about internal and external stakeholders. So in addition to your customers, you will be talking to activists, you will be talking to the government, you'll be talking to trade, you will be talking to investors, you will be talking to the end consumer, of course, but you have a lot of people in the ecosystem that you need to communicate with, which is why I believe that communication is really, really important in your entrepreneurial journey. My question to all of you is, how well do you know your customer? Do you really understand your customer, or are you projecting your own perceptions on the customer? So I've built this framework, which I call the Smart Customer Framework, to make you understand your customer a little better. It starts with the demographics, psychographics, and importantly, consumer insights. We look at the customer journey and where your product fits into the picture. And also in today's world, it is very important for us to know the online behavior of our customers, since most of them consume content on their smartphones. Let us look at demographics. This is the quantitative way of defining your consumer. So it looks at age, income, geographical spread, it looks at religion, it looks at gender, and so forth. So this is the quantitative description of your consumer, very important when you're doing your demand estimation studies. Psychographics, on the other hand, looks at the consumer's values, attitudes, and lifestyles. And this becomes very important when you need to pitch something to this consumer, whoever it may be. So what I put up here is something called the VALS framework, where customers are very conveniently divided into 8 types. While I don't accept stereotypes, it is very useful for us as marketers to understand what our consumer looks for from a psychological perspective. The other thing that you must be aware of is the decision-making role that your customer plays in the whole purchase process. Now, this decision-making role could be of an initiator, it could be of a buyer, it could be of a decision maker. Now, while this happens at the household level, it is equally important at the B2B level, where you may have to contend with a committee who takes decisions on purchase. I want to spend a little bit of time on something called a customer insight. And I have found that this can be gauged only through very deep qualitative research. But if you can get a good insight about your product or service, you can build some amazing campaigns on it. So a consumer insight is a peek into your consumer's mind. It is also what is called an underlying human truth. And if you can tap into this, you will have a very, very powerful positioning. Let me give you a few examples. All of us are aware of the happy hours phenomenon, particularly at bars in Bangalore. Gold Star Beer tapped into the insight that women like to go to the bar, but not so much to drink as to socialize, while men go to the bar more to drink. And this was a very interesting insight, on the basis of which they built the entire happy hours concept, which is prevalent all over the country. Nike understands that within all of us is an athlete and who wants to be the best that he or she can be. So we all don't want to be Roger Federer, but we definitely want to be the best we can be. And this is what Nike as a brand helps us to do. Finally, Mountain Dew, which is a very edgy brand, talks about those breathtaking moments in life which Mountain Dew helps you celebrate. So consumer insights, to reiterate, are very, very important for you as marketeers. And it will give you that competitive edge that a larger organization may not have. So how do you decide on these consumer insights? How do you find these consumer insights? The thought here is, don't just analyze your customer and observe them. Try and live the life of your consumer. And the point I'm trying to make here is, the better you know your consumer, the deeper and richer your communication and your pitch will be. Let us look at a very interesting example of Willie Davidson, who was the marketing head of the famous Harley-Davidson company, also one of the four brothers who owns the company. Willie Davidson actually lived the Harley life. And while we all can't go dress to work like this, we can definitely do what Willie did, which is to live the Harley life. The next part of my customer framework touches on the customer journey. Some of the points on the slide are obvious when we talk about who bought, what they bought, when they bought. What is not captured so often and so regularly is why they bought. And I'm going to add another dimension to this when I talk about understanding why the consumer did not buy. And in my opinion and experience, knowing why they didn't buy is actually as important as knowing why they bought something. So please always understand, if a customer does not buy, ask him in a non-threatening way why they didn't buy, and you will get some amazing insights from these conversations. This is a very interesting model that I have used and implemented over the years. It's called the hierarchy of effects model. It's a buyer behavior model. And the reason I'm putting it up here is at your stage of evolution, where you have scarce or limited resources, you need to deploy your resources wisely. And this is a good way of finding out at which stage your customer is. Now, for example, if your customer is in the hot stage, is going to buy in the next 3 months, then it is worth your putting your sales resources to ensure that you get a conversion. But if the customer is not going to buy in the next 3 months, and looking at a 6-month framework or beyond that, you probably just need to keep in touch, but don't waste your precious sales resources on such a customer. So it is very important for you to deploy your resources accordingly, which is why I thought the Lavid-Steiner model would be an interesting model for you to apply and look at. I'm going to spend a minute on B2B brands. And this is important because while we do form relationships with our FMCG and B2C consumers, the relationship is much deeper in the case of a B2B brand, primarily because the person who is buying your product is not buying it for himself or herself personally, but for the organization which they support. And from the performance of the product builds the relationship and the emotions of reassurance. So it is not a completely objective relationship. There is a degree of subjectivity in the kind of peace of mind that you give these customers. I cannot emphasize enough on the importance of relationships, especially in the B2B space, where the consideration set is very small. There are hardly 3 to 5 brands in a buyer's consideration set. And if you don't get yourself into that set, you will not be considered for an RFP or for the tendering process. So it is very important to be in that consideration set. That comes from building a relationship with the customer and ensuring that your product or service delivers whatever it is supposed to do. It is also a research fact that it is 6 times cheaper to sell to a known customer than an unknown. Coming to the digital behavior of the consumer, and this is something we all must be aware of. The new omni-channel, omni-media consumer who consumes your brand and the product and service anytime, anywhere, and on any device. So as marketers, we should be prepared to support this new consumer, especially after the COVID, where we went digital with a vengeance. So if you look at the digital consumer journey, it follows this typical bow tie pattern, which means that you have to create awareness and interest in your consumer. But after that, the consumer takes over and looks around for friends and family to approve the purchase before he actually makes it. And if he's pleased or displeased with the product or service, then there is either a negative word of mouth that develops, or he advocates your product or brand. So the typical inverted funnel, marketing funnel, used for traditional media has sort of changed into this bow tie pattern where there is a lot of focus on getting approval from your network and in turn advocating the brand. As Professor David Rogers from Columbia says, a customer is no longer just an individual, but is an individual and the network, which is why he says we focus on the hive and not just the individual bee. And I thought this was a very, very interesting analogy in today's highly networked world. So no longer is it enough for it to be a one-way street where the manufacturer or the company talks to its consumers. In today's hyper-connected world, everyone is speaking to everyone else. So your vendors are speaking to your employees are speaking to your analysts, right? Customers are speaking to employees and so forth. So it's no longer enough for us to have one single channel of communication. We have to make it interactive, and we have to be equipped to handle the various conversations that are going on about our product or brand at various levels. I keep hearing people say that they want to build communities. I don't think we need any more communities unless there's something very, very special about what you're trying to say. Communities are built by customers, not by companies. And these communities are self-contained and in some cases very closed. So this is a further challenge for today's market. Yeah? How do I get into a closed community? How do I promote my product without seeming to do so? This is a big challenge that most digital marketers are facing today. No discussion about the omni-channel consumer would be complete unless we talk about influencers. There are three types of influencers that I would like to introduce to you. So one are the big broadcast influencers like Oprah Winfrey. You have what are called niche influencers, say like a Warren Buffett or a Simon Sinek or any financial analyst who speak to a very, very limited audience. And then you have a new interesting kind of influencer called the peer influencer, who it doesn't have a very large following, but has great credibility in his network because he is not as highly commercialized as the other two. In this second piece, I'm going to talk about building your value proposition. I cannot emphasize enough how important this value proposition is to you. There are 4 parts to this value proposition, and I want you to be clear that you should be able to define your organization or your product in terms of these 4 buckets. The reason it is becoming so important in today's world is because of our decreasing attention spans. So your audience is going to give you precisely 30 seconds to state your case before they tune out and start looking at their mobile phones. Building your value proposition is absolutely critical to running your business. It is not just a statement that you put up on your presentation deck, but I believe that it is the strategic essence of your business because it covers 4 very, very important components. Your consumer, the pain or the benefit that the consumer has or is seeking to remove, how your product is going to do this, and how you are better than everybody else. The discipline of the value proposition is that you need to do this in 1 sentence and 30 seconds. It may sound a little odd when I say this, but it is very important that those first 30 seconds of any communication or any pitch that you're making covers what you do. In fact, you can actually use a value proposition to define yourself as well. Here's an example of a value proposition that I have put up. This is for a mobile application called Evernote, which used to be very popular. If you look at the way it is structured, we are talking about busy professionals. Their problem is that they're always on the move and need to keep things organized for themselves. Therefore, we have Evernote, which is a mobile application, rated very highly by its users, which does just that and ensures that you have your to-do lists and everything you need to know anytime, anywhere, and on any device. Right? So this is the way I would like you to look at your value proposition and structure it. It is actually one of the most difficult things you're going to do because in your passion for your product, you tend to want to put everything into it. And remember, you've got 1 sentence and 30 seconds. In this module, I'm going to talk about understanding your competition. We tend to forget that we are living in a competitive world, and every category today faces intense competition. So we need to understand the competition and we need to ensure that we are better than them. One of the points I would like to make here is how do you depict your competition? And I find that this little petal diagram that I put up is a very useful way to understand and depict your competition visually. Now you could use a chart as well. There's no harm in that, or a 2x2 matrix. But I think a petal diagram is a fairly neat way of establishing how you're better than your competition. Don't look at competition as direct competition. In today's technologically enabled world, you can have competition from anywhere. The barriers of entry are very, very low, and anybody can compete with you in any segment. Look at Amazon. They're competing with all the brands across so many segments because they follow whatever the customer wants. I want to talk about a very subjective concept called customer value. What do we mean by true customer value? And it is very important for us as marketers to understand that customers do not look at us in terms of our product or service or quality, but they look at us holistically as the entire experience that we bring to the table. So please remember, when you're building your product or service, it is not your features that your customer is buying. It is the benefits, and from that benefit, the derived value for the consumer. It's very tough to define this value. And as I mentioned earlier, value is as perceived by the consumer. One of the bits of advice that I would like to give you is don't position your product on price alone. I mean, price is important in today's world. But if you position your product on price, there will be your next competitor who will come in and undercut you, and then your whole proposition will be done with. Quality is another very subjective area that I would like you to be careful with. Just saying I'm better quality doesn't make any sense unless you can prove it with data. And even if you can do that, the consumer has a perceived notion of quality, and sometimes it's very, very hard to break that. So I end again with quoting two of my favorite icons, Bezos and Steve Jobs, where I say that your entire focus should be on the customer, and not only that, your entire product should start with the customer and work backwards. Your first assignment, which you will need to submit on the learning platform, is to write a short note defining what you do. I've broken this up into various components, and you need to answer each of them. But please remember, you cannot exceed the word limit for each. In fact, the crisper and the shorter your description is, the better your value proposition will be. I have just put up the whole thing in terms of a rough chart so you can understand that from the product or service come the features, which are the physical features, and they lead to three types of benefits for your consumer. So these could be physical, emotional, and today's world, social. Now, these benefits cannot be just statements. They need to be rooted back into your product or service. So the primary benefit is what is called what's in it for me. When I say me, I'm talking about our consumer. What is the primary benefit that your consumer wants from your product or service? And do you have the credibility to deliver that to him? Right? So this is the first step and the first assignment that I would like you to do. After this, I want you to actually convert your words into a visual poster. Again, I have created a very rough diagram of the same that you can refer to. You need a headline, which is your primary benefit. You need a key visual, which is either your picture of your consumer, your consumer's consumer, if you're in the B2B space, or an abstract which depicts your technology. Preferably use a human visual here. It gives your whole product or brand a face. You have some space for what is called body copy, which is basically 2 or 3 points to support your headline. And please don't forget the call to action which is at the bottom, which says, how does your customer connect with